The inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
One day, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
For those of us old enough, the voice and the life are more than a memory. They shaped us. In 2011, what is the legacy of Dr. King among those who are not old enough to remember him personally? Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. As a senior in high school in 1963 at Covington Catholic, I thought the March on Washington was irresponsible, inflammatory, and dangerous. But Dr. Martin Luther King's words that day, his creative adaptation of nonviolence as a tool for social action and change, and his move to Chicago to confront Northern racism became one of the major forces that helped change the way I thought about who I wanted to be and my responsibilities to society. 4 years later, preparing to graduate from college, the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis bracketed my formation as a young adult. I, like many of my generation, think of ourselves as children of Dr. King. But most Americans today are too young to have been formed directly by him. On this weekend, that we stop to ponder his significance as an American, how do people a bit younger think of the influence of Dr. King? To explore that, I am joined this morning by David Singleton, the Executive Director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. OJPC is a nonprofit law firm that works for statewide reform of the criminal justice system. The focus is on helping incarcerated individuals productively reintegrate into society when they are released and to eliminate social disparities in the justice system. And Sherman Bradley, the Vice President of the City Gospel Mission in Over the Rhine. The mission provides a variety of services for men and women as well as families, including meals, emergency shelter, and alcohol and drug rehabilitation. Mr. Bradley also works with organizations across the country to help them understand the dynamics of poverty and homelessness through an organization entitled Consider the Poor. Welcome to Newsmakers. And
thank you.
David, in your case, welcome back. Sherman, welcome for the first time.
Thank you for having us.
As I said, both of you are sort of a generation younger than me. For you personally, David, what is the influence, what was the influence as you were developing of Dr. King, the image, the stories you heard, etc.?
Well, growing up as a young boy, my parents talked all the time about Dr. King and how moving his message of love and loving your enemies and working in a nonviolent way to solve problems. That was a message I grew up with. As I became an adult and a lawyer, his message has certainly influenced my desire to serve communities, particularly communities of color that have been struggling. And this day, I firmly believe that Dr. King would be deeply troubled by what is known as the war on drugs and how it has devastated poor communities of color. And my work right now, part of my work is to make the criminal justice system smarter and fairer for folks who are trapped in it.
Okay. Sherman, what about you? What about growing up first?
Very early on, it was very similar. My parents were both very much advocates of nonviolent protest and how to use your brain as well as your heart in the struggle for equality and for justice. My father spent 33 years with the Ohio Department of Transportation, his first and only job outside of the Marines, and had at least 2 stints, I recall, where he had to go to court for civil rights infractions, that he was determined to have justice and equality and opportunity inside the organization so that he could continue to excel and provide for his family. My mother worked 29 years for her own first and only job for Social Security for the government building downtown. So they were enmeshed in middle class while growing up in generational poverty. So I got to hear about the struggles and how they viewed the civil rights movement as being benefactors of it to be where they are, and how I needed to further that by getting good grades, going to school, and doing something positive. Coming full circle as an adult, being a preacher myself, his passion for people, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and his quest even beyond the African American experience, but to look at the socioeconomic issues, I think is what most feared the most about him. And that has been very instrumental for me in being in our community where we are, especially in Cincinnati, with the polarization issues that we've had.
So what you're saying is, this isn't just, for him, it wasn't just about race, it was
Absolutely
about these
not.
socioeconomic questions, and I think that was clear from the beginning, but it was especially clear once he moves to Chicago, I think.
Yes.
It just puts it in a whole different context.
But it was
that
lost
story.
on many.
It was, okay.
Yeah.
What do you tell those stories to your children? Do you use Dr. King with your children?
I do not. My youngest has grown up in the UK, so her experience is much far more removed. And my oldest has, both of them being biracial, have different perspectives on, experientially, on the American culture. Generationally, but also ethnically. So it's been lost on them a lot.
David, what about you?
We talk to our daughter Allison all the time about Dr. King, and usually it comes up in the context of the work that I do, since I represent people who most of society wants to shun. And the message that Dr. King would say is we've got to find a way to forgive folks and welcome them back as brothers and sisters when they've done wrong. And so that provides an opportunity for me in discussions with my daughter about the work and why I do it to talk about Dr. King. And he is one of her heroes.
You know, one of the things, Sherman, you say you're a minister. I mean, it's impossible to understand Dr. King, it seems to me, without coming to grips with his religious experience, his religious vision, and his way of speaking in public. I mean, probably the reason it took so many white Americans by surprise is because of the cadences, and brought something, a whole nother language, vocabulary, rhetoric into American life that wasn't there before. I just find it fascinating.
Well, it was definitely different than what was the norm at that particular time. And it gave also voice to a culture of African Americans who got to see somebody in prominence in the country, which wasn't happening at that time, to model after, to say, you know, there's more to my life than what I've been doing. And from a preacher standpoint, I think it challenged many and gave others an opportunity to say, you know, we have a place in this society and we can be who we are in it, because he did not try to fit a particular cookie cutter mode of what he thought folk thought he should be. And that was huge for the culture at that time.
Yeah. Both of you are certainly middle class yourselves. You described yourself as growing up middle class. David, I don't know about you.
Grew up middle class, we struggled, but.
Okay. But you both devote your lives to working with people who aren't middle class, or who at least at the moment are finding themselves in very difficult situations. What is that? What brought you to that path, rather than, say, a path of, you're a lawyer, you could have been in a firm doing other kinds of law? Was there part of that inspiration of a holdover from Dr. King and the other people who were active at that time that had an influence on why you want to do what you do?
I think so, for me. I mean, I grew up certainly watching the I Have a Dream speech many times and talking to my folks about Dr. King. And for me, going back to the neighborhood where I was born in the South Bronx, I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, going back to the South Bronx and seeing that neighborhood and how devastated it was, and realizing that I had a very fortunate break to have two parents who cared a lot about me and raised me in a good home. I could have gone a different way. And for me, that moment when I was 19 years old, walking into the South Bronx neighborhood where I would have been living and seeing the devastation, convinced me that I had to go go on a path where I was serving people who didn't have the same opportunities as me.
Sherman, what about you? What brought you to this work?
Well, My parents were 5 when we moved out. I mean, I was 5 when my parents bought the first home and moved out of generational poverty. But both my parents grew up in generational poverty. Their siblings, some of them are still living in generational poverty today. Laurel Homes, Richmond Village, Parktown, before some of the regentrification that's going on. That's my new word. It depends on which side of the coin you're on.
Give me that one again.
That's a good one.
Regentrification.
All right, okay.
You got redevelopment on one side, gentrification on the other, and folk were displaced. But I have relatives who are still down there. I have an aunt who still lives in Richmond Village today, and she babysat me back in the 60s there. And so it's always been with me. It's always been a part of me. Coming to the late 90s and finding myself in Over the Rhine, and then the uprisings that took place in 2001, it became very clear to me where my passions lie and what the next at least decade of my life was going to look like. And I've been fighting that fight ever since, helping the homeless, helping those that are struggling with substance abuse. Many of them are coming from a variety of socioeconomic bases, but those who have been in generational poverty have had a special influence on my heart because I experientially can understand, and it's very difficult for them to understand some of the dynamics of mainstream society.
You work with people who, in some cases, have drug issues. You talked about the devastating impact of drugs on the African American community. Can you develop that a little bit? I mean, drugs were out there when Dr. King was prominent, but not like they are in the last 30 years. Talk about that a little bit.
I don't know that I would agree that, I think what's changed is the focus on so-called getting tough on crime and locking up drug offenders. What has happened is that we've had an exponential growth in the prison population. It's just off the charts. And a lot of those faces that we see in prison are young black folks from urban communities who are locked up. And what studies show is that black folks don't use drugs disproportionately more than whites. Whites actually commit more drug crimes, yet blacks are targeted more. And it really has a devastating impact on the community because although discrimination in housing and employment based on race is illegal, it's perfectly legal to discriminate based on a criminal record. So this war on drugs has really devastated the community because it means that when folks are coming out of prison, it's really hard to find a job, get on your feet, and be productive. And I really recommend to all the viewers here to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It really lays that out very persuasively. But that is something that I'm certain Dr. King would be deeply troubled by and in the forefront of fighting for criminal justice reform and the end to the war on drugs if he were here now. And I mean, we're not saying that that folks should just walk around and use drugs, but it should be treated as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, I think.
Well, and there's been some movements toward that by having mental health court and trying to take a deeper look at the substance abuse issue and that it has its ramifications psychologically as well as the individual choice that we have to look at and deal with because crime does play a part in it, unfortunately. But the drug epidemic, I think over the last 30 years, has become far more debilitating. The different types of drugs that have come out on the market haven't taken you as long to get addicted, and that spiral down has happened so quickly for many. And the struggle and the pain of that, coming up out of that, there aren't enough resources to be able to provide access for folk who really do want change. So where do they go when they come out if they do wind up locked up? The recidivism rate is ridiculous, and the privatization of the jail systems has not helped us either. So instead of putting money into the educational systems, there's a major disparity between urban school systems and how much per student the money gets allocated versus the other school systems. And that plays a major role in what kids wind up doing with themselves when they get to that early adolescent age.
We only have so much time left, but if beyond that issue of drugs and the justice system, if you think is there one other area that you would say would be a legacy that we ought to be focusing on and talking about in the spirit of Martin Luther King as we move forward? Would there be one other area that you would raise?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Sherman mentioned a moment ago. Education is really critical. A lot of the young folks that we represent at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center are folks who have failed out of school or been pushed out of schools. Our public schools are really challenged in significant ways, and we've got to figure out a way to deal with those issues, because it really is a school to prison pipeline for a lot of young folks.
Yes. Yes, education, education, education. I agree. We have got to do a better job of how we allocate the funds to assist these teachers who really want to produce an impact, but oftentimes are handicapped, trying to teach for a proficiency test rather than educate for life. And then we've got to take a look at these communities. We've fortunately realized ghettos don't work, so we're not recreating them, but we've got to take a look at the Section 8 issues and where folk are getting displaced housing-wise after we take back their communities, because they're winding up in communities that aren't always open to them. And then they have to relearn how to navigate the resources made available to them there, and that's challenging. So how can we get involved in assisting folk on top of displacing folk, so that wherever we place them, they have a support system to assist them with the lack of resources that they need in order to survive?
So much of that, desegregation, integration, not the same thing necessarily, education, some of these themes are very continuous from back in the 60s.
Absolutely.
And Dr. King's concerns. Thank you very much for being here this morning,
Thanks for
sharing
having us.
your
Yes.
ideas and
Thank you for
your
having us.
insights. It is sadly appropriate on Martin Luther King weekend that we are once again struggling to understand political violence in American life. After the break, join me for a discussion with a former Capitol Hill aide about coping with the ever-present threat of violence. Most of the focus in the shootings of last weekend have been on Congresswoman Giffords, Judge John Roll, and 9-year-old Christina Green. But also killed was 30-year-old Gabe Zimmerman, the community outreach director for Congresswoman Giffords. 2 other staffers in Giffords' office, Ron Barber and Pam Simon, were also injured. Welcome back. I thought it might be interesting to get a view of a former Capitol Hill staffer. I am joined this morning by Rick Robinson, who worked as a congressional aide to Senator Jim Bunning for 6 years on Capitol Hill. He ran for Congress himself in 1998. Today, Mr. Robinson is an attorney in the Northern Kentucky offices of Graydon Head and a novelist who draws on his Washington experience. Though he did not know Zimmerman, Barber, or Simon, on Sunday he posted a piece on the Daily Caller that read in part, "I did not have to know Zimmerman and his colleagues to know a lot about them." Rick, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Great to be here. Sorry for the circumstance, but I'm glad to be back on the show.
Yeah, it was your open letter, little essay, comment that really caught my attention when I saw it. And one of the things that you say here is, working for a member of Congress puts a person in a special fraternity of people who go to work each and every day trusting in the system and hoping that their work is making a difference. It doesn't matter whether you work on the Hill or back in the district. A congressional staffer remains a staffer forever. I think that's the spirit out of which you were responding.
You know, as I sat and watched all the news coverage of this weekend, I took it very personal. I suddenly felt the feeling that my brother-in-law, who's a fire chief, feels when a fireman goes down somewhere in the country. Police officers have that feeling when a police officer somewhere in the country goes down in the line of duty. Gabe Zimmerman went down in the line of duty, something that wasn't supposed to happen. And those of us who belong in that fraternity, you know, it's folks that I go across the country, and no matter where I am at a book signing or doing something else, somebody will come up and say, "I worked on Capitol Hill." And there is this bond, there is this tie that brings everybody together, and I think those of us that have worked on the Hill felt that grief, that sadness of the loss of a fraternity member on Saturday and Sunday.
You have in here, and I find it very interesting, a staffer not only supports their boss, but they also live vicariously through them. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, it's the job of the staffer to be in the background. It's the job of the staffer to be one step behind the member. When you're trying to get an article done about an issue, it's your job not to get your name in the paper. It's your job to get your boss's name in the paper. And so when there is a success, when there is something happen, when you get a good editorial, when you get a good article, that's a victory for you. That lifts you up. That gives you that type of vicarious feeling that the boss did well, so you're doing well too.
Mm-hmm. Among staffers, and I right now have a godson who's working on the Hill, I have a feeling from the people I know who have worked there that the staffers, whether they're Republican or Democratic, they interact and get along and deal with the issues maybe a lot better, or because they're working behind the scenes. It's a different dynamic than maybe people think that exists up there?
Oh, the staffers, and again, it doesn't matter whether they're D's or R's, conservatives or liberals. The staffers all hang out at the same places. They all know each other. They've all gone to the same type of events. Each state, for instance, has a society that gets together and holds meetings, holds events, holds formal balls when it comes to the time of inaugurations. It has Christmas parties. So you get to know the people that are the staffers from your state and staffers from other state, and really political ideology doesn't matter when you get to those meetings. It's everybody getting around and sharing their love of the institution. And that's the one thing that bonds them together, is that they do believe in the institution of Congress.
To what extent, while you were there for 6 years, right?
6 years, yes.
To what extent was the potential of violence in the forefront or in the back of your mind?
When you're out at a public event, I can tell you that it's always in the back of your mind. When you're taking a look at the boss, you're looking at the crowd, you're looking at what's happening. I've talked with this over the last couple of days with several staffers that I worked with when I was on the Hill, of saying, remember that time where we would be at a public meeting, or we would have one of our open door sessions, or we would be out on the campaign trail. And one of Jim's, for instance, field representatives was a former police officer. And I can remember on several occasions walking up to John Salyers and going, hey, John, keep an eye on that person over there. Something doesn't feel right. Something doesn't look right in this situation. We had a staffer one time that was run off the road by somebody during a campaign. Again, that type of feel that you get that creepy feeling. And again, I think why congressional staffers felt so strongly about Gabe Zimmerman and what happened to him was that we've all been in that situation where something just didn't feel right.
And are there many resources? I know there was a meeting this past Wednesday at Congress to try to talk about this, but are there many resources that you can call on if you think, I'm sure the office, every member of Congress probably gets hate mail, and that letter that is like, oh my gosh, this one could be real. What kind of resources do you have to really follow up on that?
They do have procedures, and they do have things that they follow. And in fact, I know in recent years, the Capitol Hill Police have actually stepped up the procedures for district offices to make sure that they know how to contact the local police, how to, they've gotten to the point even that in most offices you have to buzz in and out of the doors. You can't just walk into the offices anymore. They can actually look outside and see who's trying to come in and what's going on. I think probably though the best comment about it is Jon Stewart saying the other night that you just can't outsmart crazy.
Right.
And we find ourselves in a situation that I don't know that from the congressional staffer side you can ever fully protect the congressional office from some crazy coming in.
Well, and the whole point is that people in public life, they're committed to interacting with whoever walks in. I mean, that is
Precisely.
part of it too. You don't want to screen it too much.
Yeah, and that's what the interesting thing is. Gabe Zimmerman, apparently I've been doing some research on him. I'm going to do a follow-up article this week in the Daily Caller on him. Apparently Gabe Zimmerman was that guy. He was that guy that had the empathy. I put in the article that, constituent service is what happens when your grandma needs to make a phone call to get her Social Security check. Mm-hmm. And Gabe Zimmerman was exactly the kind of guy you wanted answering the phone when grandma needed that help.
Yeah.
He had the empathy, he had the dedication, he had the loyalty to be a staffer, and he truly, if he didn't get that check delivered, if he didn't help that happen, he truly went to bed at night fretting about that.
Well, you know, that's the thing. You know, people think that it's all about these big issues and policy questions, but for the staffers, there's a lot of just mundane helping people get through the bureaucracy.
And helping people through the bureaucracy, Dane, you've hit it right on the head. I contend that constituent service is the most important thing from a policy standpoint that members of Congress do, because it's hand-to-hand delivery of government to people and making them believe that in fact the government can work for them.
Well, Rick, thank you very much for
Thank you
your
very much,
service on the Hill, for what you do today in our community, for your books, and we'll have you back.
Thanks,
And
Sam.
we were talking about maybe an occasion in the near future. Thank
so.
you for